Hey, welcome to another Tuesday Tech Talk, everybody. We have in front of us today Jen, a PCF developer, former Pivotal Labs pivot, and she is going to talk to us about the land before Bosh. So with that, take it away.
So this is actually not, I don't know if this thing is working, but let me know if this isn't working or if you can't hear me. Thumbs up. Okay, cool. So this actually isn't a talk about the history of Bosh. This is actually about the land before you get Bosh, kind of like the land before time. The reason why this is like a really interesting area is because in order to get Bosh, there have been a multitude of solutions that have been created by different people for their needs. So some people might use Terraform. Some people might have used bash scripts that would like concatenate all of the things that you needed together in order to get a director and then potentially update that director or essentially do any interaction with that director. And this actually made the installation process really hard. And you need a director in order to get things like PCF. In order to get CF deployment, either open source or closed source, you need a director. So the installation process should be smoother, but it wasn't for a long time. And that was actually like a really big pain point. And so that pain was kind of felt, and something was created called bosh-bootloader. This is actually the long name. The short name is BBL, Bubble, that my team maintains. It's a command line utility, and for 5 different infrastructures as a service, you can actually get a director and a secure environment in order to deploy anything that you want to that environment. So yeah, so you're going to see a few of these guys in this slide deck. All right, so how do you get this working? You're going to sit at a terminal. The first thing that you're going to do is get yourself the CLIs that you need for this to work. So you can install Bosh because that's both the CLI and the name of the software. You have to install Bubble, which is the tool that I'm about to talk about, and you also need to install Terraform. So what Bubble is actually doing is it's a Go library or Go command line utility that automates other CLIs that automate VMs. It's really a lot of automation, actually. But you need those other CLIs because that's what we're going to shell out to in order to sort of orchestrate the life cycle of this environment. You can get them with Brew, but you can also get the binaries off of like the GitHub pages for these respective CLIs. All right, so the next thing that you need before you can bubble up is you actually need IS credentials. So for example, on Azure, you're going to need things like a subscription ID, a tenant ID, client secret. This is how you authorize Bubble to go and do things in your IaaS, like create VMs, change IAM policies, do a whole bunch of stuff in there. All right, so you run Bubble up. This is like bare minimum, on the rails, simple environment. Okay, so what happens first? The first thing that Bubble does is pave your IaaS. So that's the cloud. It's shaped like a cloud because we call it cloud. And the way that Bubble does that is using Terraform. So you might have heard that word a lot. Terraform is complicated, but it is essentially sort of a language that you can use to pave your IaaS that looks the same across all the IaaSes. So you won't write the same Terraform for each IaaS, but the syntax will look the same. So what Bubble has built inside of it are these Terraform templates for multiple IaaSes in order to like partition your network, give you the right security group rules, firewall rules, potentially load balancers, things like that. So in order to pave the IaaS, we use Terraform. The next thing that Bubble does is create a Jumpbox. So this is the first VM that we're going to bring up. And this VM is going to act as like a bastion to the system. So it's like a single point of entry. This is actually really valuable because a lot of people don't necessarily do that. And what they were doing was putting the director directly on the internet. So you had multiple ports available on this VM. And so anybody could kind of like attack at multiple ports from the internet. Instead, what we do is we put a Jumpbox in front of it. There's only one port open on the Jumpbox, and the Jumpbox is the only person that can talk to the director VM other than like other VMs that have been deployed by the director. All right, so once we have a Jumpbox, we actually set up an SSH Tunnel and SOCKS5 proxy in order to proxy our request to create a director through it. In order to like abide by the security rules that we put in place, which is like nobody should talk to the director unless it's the Jumpbox. All right, so at this point you have infrastructure, you have a Jumpbox, and you have a director. The next thing that you're gonna want Bubble for is actually to provide that tunnel for you. Or historically, so before Bubble 6, which is the latest release, we had to set up this like SSH tunnel for you in order to talk to your director and like deploy Cloud Foundry to it. We recently updated the Bosh CLI to actually do this functionality for you, so there weren't a bunch of just like errant SSH tunnels like hanging around or something like that, which can actually get very confusing for the system itself. So we no longer need to do that. All we need to do is like eval this command called bubble printenv, which is like, bubble printenv is just a whole bunch of like text that like export this credential, export this Bosh all proxy environment variable, etc. And then the Bosh CLI is going to use all of those environment variables. So that's why we have to evaluate it, is so that it sets the environment variables that like Bubble thinks you need to have in order to talk to your director. All right. So now that you actually have this connection to the director through the Jumpbox, you can deploy Concourse. So some of you might have heard of Concourse. Concourse is obviously our like CI continuous deployment and continuous delivery tool. When I created this presentation, I wanted to give like the smallest example of a deployment. There's definitely a smaller deployment, like 1 VM, but we're going to work with a Concourse deployment for this example. And so you're going to get things like a web VM, a worker VM, and a database VM, and they're all being created through the director, through the Jumpbox. Okay, so some time passes. You're using your Concourse. It's like super great. But then, you know, you want to get rid of your Concourse. Maybe you're switching IaaSes for like cost reasons. So you might be going from like AWS to GCP. No offense to AWS. And so you're going to delete the deployment. And the reason why you can't just say like Bubble tear down everything is because Bubble actually doesn't know that this is what you have deployed in your IaaS anymore. So what Bubble's going to do is going to be like, oh, like if you tried to destroy before deleting the deployment, Bubble would like look at this cloud and be like, oh, there's a whole bunch of VMs in there that I don't know anything about. So I'm not going to let you destroy that because that sounds like a bad idea. And so instead, you have to delete the deployment yourself. So you're going to take down the VMs that the director deployed, and then Bubble can actually like participate in this process and tear everything down for you. So you take down the Concourse deployment, and then we start taking bits away. So it's very symmetrical. When you do Bubble up, you're going IaaS paving Jumpbox director. When you bubble down, you take down the director, you take down the Jumpbox, you take down the IaaS. So we're going to go through that. So what Bubble's going to do is it's going to start up again a tunnel in order to take down the director. Then it's going to try and take down the Jumpbox. And then eventually it will just take down all of your infrastructure. And everything will be gone. All of the files that Bubble created will go away. All right. So this was like bare minimum, or like the easiest sort of solution to get a director that you want to do anything with. Because Bubble is like really trying to support some of our open source solutions like CF deployment and Concourse deployment, and just a whole bunch of other sort of like configuration options for people, we've started to open up Bubble. It used to be like a black box. It used to be this binary that just did stuff and gave you like a JSON file that you couldn't touch or do anything with. And that made it really hard for a lot of Cloud Foundry teams to start to be like, oh, I want isolation segments. Oh, I need a different network. Oh, I need this other ops file because we're experimenting with like Cred Hub or something like that. And so we needed a way to let people sort of like interfere in the process in order to get their configuration in there. And also to make it so that it wasn't like, oh, we've provided one flag for isolation segments, but we still haven't supported all these other configuration options. Instead, what we did was like, okay, how do we just like expose the internals of Bubble so people can just inject what they want in there? All right, so what we did was we split up these two very important parts, which is like Bubble plan and Bubble up, where Bubble plan is actually going to write out all of the files that the binary or just Bubble is going to need in order to do those steps that I talked about, IaaS paving, Jumpbox director. And then bubble up is just executing those files. So like bubble plan is going to make everything, and then bubble up is going to actually run it. So let's say you want, I'm going to talk about some of the command line functions that we did create early on that we continue to support because they're widely needed. So the first one is actually Concourse load balancers. So we actually have an LB type flag for Concourse, and this will actually create load balancers that are specific for a Concourse deployment. If you want Cloud Foundry load balancers, you can do the same thing. In this case, you'll want to provide a cert and a key. All right, a completely different example is isolation segments. So we actually have created this whole new concept of a plan patch, which is like your way of like patching the plan so that up executes with the configuration that you want. So what you'll do is you'll bubble plan in this like empty directory and a whole bunch of stuff is written. And then you can just copy one of our patches into this file system, into this directory. And when you run bubble up, it'll like take those overrides from your configuration and work with that. For isolation segments, it's there's like a combination of things that we needed to like have interfere, which was like we needed an additional Terraform template, we needed an additional Terraform variable, and we needed some cloud config operations files. All right, here's another example. You want to add an ops file so that you can send logs to an external syslog drain. So what we did was, in order for you to interfere, you have to inject this ops file in this command called create-env, which is like the bosh way of making bosh. So what we do is like when we write a bunch of files, we write these things called create director script and delete director script, which is like what bubble is going to execute. And you can copy those into overrides and then modify the overrides to do the thing that you want. So for instance here, this is what the script will look like after you've made modifications, which is like you'll add additional variables that you need for the external syslog drain, and then you'll apply the ops file. And then you'll do symmetrically the same thing with the delete director script. All right, and then after you've made those modifications, you can bubble up and your director has been modified with the configuration that you want. In order to update a director, so when I say update a director, we have these things called stem cells, and so those things are constantly being updated and worked on. In order to change that version, you need the latest bosh deployment manifest. In order to get that version, you need the latest bubble. So you upgrade your version of bubble, you bubble plan, so it like updates that bosh deployment manifest inside of your state directory with a new version of the stem cell, and then it just bubbles up and it applies that new manifest to your director. So your director is like, oh, okay, I'll pull down the latest version of the stem cell now. And that's how you sort of like get an update to your director. Yeah?
You want questions now or yeah?
Whenever you want.
So does this override the normal files but not the override files?
Exactly. Override files are your files. Everything else that Bubble controls, you just shouldn't interfere with because you'll lose those changes. So this is how we've sort of like tried to keep it so that there are Bubble files and there are your files. In this way, the bosh deployment manifest is a Bubble file. And then there's this thing called the cloud config. For people who aren't quite familiar with the cloud config, a director deployment manifest can be IaaS agnostic because we've extracted all of these like IaaS specific features into something called a cloud config. So in order for you as like a user to be like, oh, I want to change the VM type or like the definition of some VM type that the director is going to use, you want to modify the cloud config. So there might be some VM type called minimal, and you're like, oh, I don't really like that disk size. It needs to be a bigger disk size. You're going to modify the cloud config. So this is similar to the isolation segments plan patch. You're going to bubble plan, copy your ops file into something called a cloud config directory of your current bubble directory, and then bubble up, and that will just update the cloud config that's on the director. Bosh is now supporting multiple cloud configs, so this feature isn't really necessary because what you can do is just target the director and add your additional cloud config operations there. All right, so that's kind of it. In this like latest version of Bubble, we've added support for OpenStack and vSphere. It's like a minimal support in that there isn't Terraform. There's just maintaining the lifecycle of your Jumpbox and director so that you can kind of have a similar experience across all of the different IaaSes for your environments. And then we also added something called cleanup leftovers. So in my experience dealing with IaaSes, you orphan a whole bunch of stuff on a regular basis, and that costs you money. So instead, what we tried to do is like provide something in Bubble where you can delete or just clean up all of these things that you've left hanging around, and that doesn't have to use the environment or state directory that you're currently in. Those resources didn't need to be created by Bubble. They just need to exist in your IaaS, and you can clean them up. Yeah, that's it. Questions? Yeah.
I'm very ignorant of these terms. I didn't understand the significance of using bosh to deploy Concourse. Couldn't you have done that with PCF push?
I don't know.
Can you repeat the question?
Can you deploy Concourse with PCF push? I assume that Concourse is not really an application and PCF push is for apps. So a Concourse deployment would be like a manifest that looks a lot like your director manifest or a CF manifest, which is a whole bunch of YAML that decides like how many VMs you want, what those jobs do. I don't think that PCF push would work the same way because that's usually something that you're like uploading blobs somewhere and then like running that application. But I might be wrong in that regard.
Well, what were you doing with Concourse there? I guess I didn't understand why you used the bosh command for that.
You use the bosh command to deploy something like Concourse. So if you have these VMs that you need, like a web VM, a worker VM, and a database VM, bosh will help you manage those VMs. So if you deploy with bosh, you get all of the perks of working with bosh, period, which is like managing the software, the versions, the lifecycle of the VMs, etc.
I follow up on my earlier question. So you have these, you upgrade your bubble, and then you have these overrides.
Yeah.
But you get new bubble files. Can you get a version conflict between the two? My override basically depended on the previous bubble files, right? Can that go wrong, or is that?
Yes, you can. Yeah. So the thing is that there aren't too many ways that you could be like referencing something that might change, and we also support migrations. So like, let's say we want to move a file somewhere else, we like try to migrate that file through a command saying like, oh, you've updated, let me just make sure the file's in the right place for this version. But for instance, for bosh deployment, that's like a repo that lives outside of Bubble, and so we bin data that like in, we have like the binary for that repo inside of Bubble, and we write those files to your state directory. But let's say bosh deployment changed like the organization of their files, and you were referencing those in your override script, it would fail because you're trying to go to some path that no longer exists, and that would become transparent when Bubble tries to update your director and is like, that path doesn't work anymore. Yeah.
So in your example, you deploy Concourse.
Yeah.
Using Bubble in your bosh kind of environment. I'm guessing for like clients that run Cloud Foundry, they would, instead of deploying Concourse, this would be like the same process for you to deploy Cloud Foundry?
Yeah. Right now, there's this big motion to use like Bubble to get you Concourse, so you can get this thing called PCF pipelines, which is actually an entire Concourse pipeline built for like installing and upgrading your PCF, which is like how we want it to work. Is we want this like automated way of getting your updates as opposed to this really painful experience with Ops Manager, where like there might be errors and debug logs, and it's all kind of confusing. They're trying to support that with this thing called a PCF pipeline. And so you need Concourse for that, and the best way to get Concourse right now is to use Bubble. Yeah.
And lastly,
Yeah.
would Bubble be a good thing for me to download on, like, if I wanted to play around with bosh? Like, if I download on a local machine at
Yeah.
home, I could start up everything, and I wouldn't have to worry about...
Yeah, it takes like 10 minutes. To just get like 2 VMs, your Jumpbox and your director. Rowan can update that depending on the IaaS. Some IaaSes are slower than others.
Yeah, don't use it on your local VM.
vSphere plugin.
Yeah.
See the results anytime soon. But if you're just using an AWS or GCP,
Yeah.
it's pretty
Yeah.
fast.
Yeah.
So how many VMs does Bubble spin up? Does it depend on what you need, or just two?
Yeah, you can write override scripts for your Jumpbox and say like echo nothing, like don't actually create another VM, and then however you reach your director is up to you. So you can like bring your own bastion if you already have one, but yeah, only 2 VMs.
But then if you install, say, Concourse with it, it will know how many VMs Concourse needs and also spin those up. Or does Concourse
Bosh does that.
Bosh does that?
Yeah, so like that's why when you do Bosh deploy Concourse, Bosh is now responsible for all these VMs that you've put into the network that we set up.
And that's why Bubble doesn't know about those VMs.
Exactly, yeah. All right,
Thank you.
thank you.